Hello again everyone, Jessica with From Dream to Seed, and I have a video for all you beginning gardeners out there, and today we're going to talk about how to read a seed packet. So welcome to this extremely muggy day. I am actually getting some of my fall planting prepared. I have a tray here of kale seeds that I'm sowing, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about how to read a seed packet. I know when I first began gardening, a lot of this just looked like another language to me. There were so many terms that I had to look up. I didn't quite understand what they meant, and so I thought this would be great to explain kind of step by step what the information on the back of a seed packet is talking about, kind of go through the individual points of info on the back of a seed packet, and maybe give you some tips and tricks as to how your plants may fall a little bit outside of the information on this packet. So a few of the things that you'd want to know first before you start planting seeds that you won't find here, or you'll find minimal information here, is you want to know what growing zone you are in. So this is going to be for people in the US, and you can look it up. I'll link a website below, but you can Google what growing zone you're in. And basically the growing zone has to do with your lowest winter temperatures. And this is more for perennial plants, meaning plants that are going to be coming back year after year, because most of the plants that we're growing in a vegetable garden and a lot of our annual flowers that we're growing are just going to be growing in the summer. They're not native to this area. You won't be planting them with the hopes of them coming back the following year unless you live in a very warm climate. So for instance, I live in growing zone 6B, and my average temperatures, I think it says it can get down to negative 10 to 15. So most of your growing zone has to do with your average winter temps, but that is important if you're planting perennial flowers or shrubs or plants or trees or anything that you want to come back year after year. So definitely Google your growing zone. The second thing you're going to want to know, or second two things you're going to want to know, are your average first frost dates and your average last frost dates. So this will be really beneficial to you. So your average last frost date will happen in the spring. And you'll want to know this because if you're planting any vegetables or flowers that are very sensitive to frost, or it may severely damage them or kill them, you'll definitely want to know your last frost date, average last frost date, so you can plant those plants after that would happen. And your first frost dates are important, especially right now for me when I'm planting a fall garden, because I need these plants to mature before my first frost happens in the late fall, early winter. So if the frost will kill off these plants, I can mature they can mature and I can harvest them before the frost happens. Or for plants around here that can sustain a little bit over the winter, my kale for example, I just need to get it mature because after those frosts start to happen, it won't really grow anymore. So your last frost date and your first frost date are another great thing that you can look up. Now on many seed packets, you'll see a map on the back, and it will give you a general idea of your growing zone. And oftentimes it will tell you the months, or kind of the span of months that you can plant these seeds in. So for instance, these carrot seeds tell me that in my zone, I can plant between March and June for my spring summer sowing, and I can plant between August and September for my fall sowing. So I still like to know the specific frost dates for my area because this gives me a little bit of a more specific window to work with, especially for things like tomatoes or melons or peppers or things that are really, really susceptible to frost damage. You want to know your specific, well, you can't get super specific with it, but you want to have a general window of when your frost dates are so that you can prepare your planting around that. So one of the first things that you'll see when you pick up seed packets, and this has more to do with flowers. There's not many vegetables that you're going to be growing in your vegetable garden that are going to be perennial. There are a few, asparagus, there's definitely a few herbs that you can grow that are perennial, but for the most part, the vegetables you grow in your vegetable garden are going to be just for that season. But when you see flower packets, you'll usually see in the front, and I'll put in some close-ups, they'll either say perennial or they'll say annual. And what perennial means is in proper growing conditions, these plants will continue to come back year after year for usually a set number of years. It could be a very, very long time if it's a tree. It could be a few years if it's a flower or a small shrub. But this means that they will, if grown correctly, they will come back year after year. Whereas annual means that that plant will complete its life cycle in 1 year. So it will grow from seed to developing seeds of its own, usually in 1 year. So you will see annual versus perennial. You may also see on perennial seed packets that they will tell you what growing zones that they are perennial in. So for instance, this is lupine, and it tells me that this plant is a perennial in zones 4 through 7. So because I'm in zone 6, I can grow this as a perennial. But what it's saying is if you live outside of those zones, so in a much farther southern climate or a much farther northern climate, these may not come back year after year because the temperatures in that growing zone are not optimal for these plants to continue to reproduce the following year. So moving to the back of the seed packet where the majority of your information is going to be. Most of the time you will see sun requirements for these seeds. Now most of our vegetables are going to be grown in full sun. So for example, these carrots, you can see on the back that it will tell you that it needs to be grown in full sun. And that's pretty much the case for pretty much most vegetables. There's a few herbs that don't mind part shade and actually grow a little bit better when they have some partial shade. But for the most part, any vegetables are going to be grown in full sun. But if we look at these impatiens, this is a flower that prefers partial shade or complete shade to grow in. If they were grown in full sun, they would not grow well. They would get kind of crispy and burnt looking, or they just wouldn't grow, period. So be sure to look at the sun requirements on the back of your seed packets. Now, when it says full sun, and so for example, this lupine, it is full sun to part shade. So these can handle a little bit of shade. I would grow these in full sun. But what full sun means is it doesn't mean that you need full sun from sun up to sundown. What that usually means is you need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day. And so that is considered full sun. So moving on to some of the information, it will tell you the lifespan of that vegetable or that flower or whatever it is you're growing. And so for instance, this takes about a year to bloom. So this, because it's a perennial, it will take sometimes even a year or two to get completely established when it'll bloom. However, these carrots, and usually vegetables will say how many days to harvest, or it'll say so many days to maturity. So for example, this says 65 to 70 days to harvest. Now this is important, especially if I'm planting these in the fall, because like I said, I want to get these carrots to maturity before those hard frosts start to hit, because after that the length of our daylight, or the length of day, is shortening. It just kind of is a signal for these plants to start sleeping. So I want to make sure that I'm planting these early enough, 2.5 months ish, where they will hit maturity before those hard frosts start to hit. This will also give you an idea of when you can harvest, especially things like carrots that are underground, and sometimes it's difficult to know when to harvest them. This gives you an idea of how long after you've planted them that you can start to harvest them. Another thing that I think is really great about newer seed packets is because so many gardeners are growing in containers now, and this is great if you don't have a yard or you don't have a large space to grow in, or just you live in an apartment and you just have a patio and you want to grow in containers. There's so many seeds out there that are container friendly now. A lot of seeds are being developed to be specifically for containers, which is great. So you'll see on both of these seed packets that it says that these are container friendly. So this is the carrots and the flowers. So this, and it will tell you about how many seeds that you can plant inside those containers. So this is a really great option if you think container gardening is the best way for you to garden. So also on the back of the seed packet, you're going to see a lot of information, and it's just going to depend on the seed as to what will help this plant be successful. It could be the type of soil it likes to be planted in. It could talk about direct seeding versus starting indoors. It could tell you about fertilization. It can tell you about diseases that it's prone to. It can tell you if it's susceptible to frost damage, lots of different things. But in the interest of keeping this a shorter video, I'm going to talk mainly about how to physically plant the seeds and some of the problems you may run into. So when we talk about germination, that means the seeds emerging from the soil. So there are 4 things that come to mind that can definitely affect the germination of your seed. And that is the age of the seed, the depth at which you are planting, the moisture level of the soil, and the temperature of the soil that you're planting in. So on the back of the seed packets, it will tell you how deep you need to plant these seeds. And as a general rule of thumb, the smaller the seed, the more shallow you're going to plant that seed. So when you have something like carrots that are just teeny tiny little seeds versus a bean seed that is much bigger. Here, I don't know if you can see. The depth of these that I'm going to plant these seeds are much different. And so as a general rule, it's 2 to 3 times the width of the seed is what you want to plant. But most of the time I just look on the back of the seed packets. So for things like carrots that are just tiny little seeds, I am going to just sprinkle those across the row that I'm planting, and then I will go and sprinkle soil over top of that. Because as you can see, it's you only want to plant these to 1/2 inch, sometimes even in less than that. So I'm going to be very cautious about putting a ton of soil over top of those, because if they are too deep, the seeds are not going to have the strength to push up from underneath all that soil. Whereas a bean seed, I can plant 1 inch or sometimes even more if my soil is very light and fluffy, lots of compost, and it will have, because it's a large seedling, it will have plenty of energy to push up through that soil. Now remember, seeds don't need light to germinate. Now once they have germinated and have pushed through the soil, they're definitely going to need light, but they do not need light to germinate. What they do need is a growing medium, they need moisture, and they need to be at the correct depth. So we already talked about the depth of the seed. Now the planting medium is really important. You want to make sure that you have a planting medium that is very loose. It's not compacted, because if it's forms like a hard crust on top, the seeds can't push through. So you want to make sure it's very loose, it drains really well so that you're not having root rot when these seedlings emerge. And so I make my own seed mix from peat moss and vermiculite, but if you're a brand new gardener, I would suggest just going and getting a bag of seed starting mix. Now there's a difference between seed starting mix and potting mix. You can use potting mix, it just doesn't drain quite as well. So I would recommend specific seed starting mix. It's a great fast draining medium for seeds to grow in. So talking about the moisture level, so seeds cannot dry out when they are germinating. It will kill the seed. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you don't want to drown your seeds, as they will rot. So you definitely need to keep the top layer of the soil moist as you're waiting for those seeds to germinate. So what I like to do is, I love these trays from Gardener Supply because they come out and they have this bottom kind of tray to it, but you can get similar stuff anywhere. So I like to actually pour water in the bottom of the tray and bottom water. However, until those seedlings emerge, I just have a small spray bottle that I mist the top of the seeds, and that will keep them wet enough to let those seedlings emerge. And then after those seedlings have emerged, I will strictly bottom water. So I know I'm not having too much moisture, but I have just the right balance for those seeds to properly germinate. Soil temperature is also really important for seed germination. So some seeds will germinate in much cooler soil temperatures. So for example, carrots, kale, spinach, any of these vegetables or flowers that will grow in early spring or late spring will germinate in cooler soil temperatures. But things like beans and tomatoes and summer growing flowers, they will wait until those soil temperatures have warmed up to germinate. So if you're planting seeds that are very old or have not been stored properly, they may not germinate because they are past their prime. And so a quick germination test that you can do is to place some seeds inside of a wet paper towel, put that paper towel in a small Ziploc bag, put it on a counter, wait for about a week to week and a half, and see if those seeds have sprouted. Now you can plant those seeds that have sprouted if you'd like, but this will give you an idea now I would plant at least maybe 10 or so seeds, and this will give you an idea of how many seeds are going to germinate, or the percentage of seeds that you might have that will germinate. So if you plant 10 and only 1 germinates, then that's not a great rate for those seeds. So I'd probably just get some fresh seeds at that point. Another thing you may see on the seed packet is direct sow versus indoor seed starting or indirect sowing. So one of the things that you need to consider is the type of plant that you are planting. So for example, vegetables. There are some vegetables that do not transplant well. So for example, carrots, any beans that I grow, corn, for the most part melons or zucchini, although you can definitely start those indoors. I just don't, because the big seeds, peas, melon, zucchini, green beans, they germinate usually really well and so fast that there's really no need for me to grow them indoors. But other things like carrots and corn, they do not transplant well at all. So these are traditionally direct sown. That means they are directly sown in the ground where you are growing them. But lots of other vegetables can be transplanted or indirectly sown. And it will usually tell you on the back of the seed packet how early to start these indoors before you're going to plant them. So going back to that last frost date, for me, my last frost date is usually Mother's Day weekend. So this tells me that I can start this kale indoors 8 weeks before my last frost date. So I will count back 8 weeks from Mother's Day, and I know that that's when I can start these indoors. So knowing those frost dates are really important, and knowing what kind of vegetable that you're going to be growing, whether it likes to be directly sown or started indoors, is really important. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is seed spacing. So on the back of the packets, you will see the depth, and also you will see something that says thin too, usually. So when I am planting seeds, whether that's starting indoors or direct sowing, I plant more seeds than I think I'm going to need, and I plant them closer together than they should be grown. And that's to ensure better germination. So for example, when I'm starting indoors with this kale, in each of these small cells, I will put at least 2 or 3 seeds in these cells, and that will ensure germination, that at least hopefully one will germinate, although I do recommend doing that germination test before. It also allows me to pick the strongest seedling when I go to thin them. So you usually want to thin seedlings when they have put on their true leaves. So most plants will grown from seed, will put up 2 small leaves, and then after that, the next set of leaves will be what's called their true leaves. And usually the true leaves will look a lot different than the first seed leaves that emerge. So once the seedlings have put on their true leaves, that's when you can start to thin them. And usually it will tell you the spacing to thin them. So for example, these carrots, you want to thin to at least 3 inches apart. And that just is going to allow proper growth for these carrots. They're not going to be too crowded. They're going to grow into much bigger carrots than they would if they were much closer together. Now for some vegetables, you definitely want to follow that seed spacing, especially these bigger vegetables that have big root systems, tomatoes and things like that. They're going to have big sprawling kind of root systems that are deep underground, so you definitely don't want to crowd those. Although you can, if you're growing vertically or heavily pruning those tomatoes, you can definitely play around with the spacing. Some vegetables, like especially leafy greens, they don't mind being a little bit crowded. So for example, this says thin to 18 inches. I grow kale sometimes 6 inches apart. It doesn't mind, it has very shallow root systems. It doesn't mind the crowding. However, you have to be careful of fungal and disease issues where you're not getting as much airflow. So I've kind of experimented over the years in my particular garden how closely I can grow things, usually leafy greens, and I can play around with the spacing. But what that means is thin to 18 inches. They're saying after those seedlings have emerged, if you're direct growing, or if you're growing indoors and then planting outside, you want to space those seedlings 18 inches apart or thin the seedlings 18 inches apart. And thinning just means that I like to take small scissors. I don't like to pull seedlings out because you might disrupt the neighboring seedlings. I just take small scissors and I just clip those little seedlings off of the base. I know that's really hard for some people to do, but you're going to get a much better result if you're thinning those seedlings and giving the strongest seedlings room to grow. So thanks so much for joining me today. I've got to get this kale planted or it's going to be way too late to grow into the fall. I hope you learned something. If you have any more questions about reading a seed packet, please leave in the comments below. Give me a thumbs up or subscribe. Please share with your friends if you appreciate this new gardener growing information. And any other ideas you have for videos, I would greatly appreciate. Thanks so much. I'll see you soon.